Hello and welcome to the Adventure Toolkit example reel number 9. My name is Glenn Storm and I'm from Hot Iron Productions. Today we're going to look at tools from the Event folder, starting with the counter trigger. The counter trigger is designed to accept a number of triggers before activating another object. In this case I've got a sphere that I'd like to activate after a number of triggers. Let's look at the properties on the counter trigger. First is the target count, and this is the number of times to count before activating another object, and I've set this to 3. Next is count on activate, and if this box is checked, then the counter trigger is waiting to be activated, and that is what it's going to count. If it's unchecked, if count on activate is unchecked, then the counter trigger is assuming that there is a collider on this object, and instead of counting its activation, it's going to count the number of times it is collided with. Okay, but I am going to activate this. The next property is activate on complete, and this is the object reference that will be activated once the target count is reached, and in this case we're talking about the sphere. The next property is valid collider. If count on activate is off and you have your collider on this object, but you don't want every collision to count. You only want a particular collider's collision to count, say the player character's collision. Then what you can do is put a reference of that object here, and that's the only one that will count. Alright, but we're going to activate this instead. Let's go ahead and hit play, and I'm going to activate the counter trigger. Because, however, it is count on activate, you'll notice that it will immediately deactivate it and wait for another trigger, or another activation. So I'm going to click it once, click it twice, click it a third time, and there's our sphere. That's what the counter trigger does. Let's move on to the next tool. It's the Event Manager. And we looked at this before. We're going to look at it again. This time what we're doing, well, what the Event Manager does, I should say, is handle events. Events as defined as a number of objects you would like to activate at once, or deactivate. That's what an event is in this context. In this case, I've got a rocket, and I would like to launch the rocket. This is not simply going to be a mover moving the rocket, although I am going to do that. I also have some particle emitters. They're going to represent thrust on the rocket, and I want that all to start at the same time. So I need to handle that with an Event Manager. So let's look at the properties on our Event Manager. This is, well, it's the only property. It's an array of event steps. Okay, and I've got 2 events that I have defined on this Event Manager. Let's look at the properties of each step. There's event label, so I can name this something other than element 0 and element 1. There's a number of objects I can define as objects to activate. In this case, I do want to activate 2 particle emitters and the mover at the same time. I can also define a number of objects to deactivate. That's the next property. But in this event, I don't actually want to deactivate anything. The last property in each event step is called Affect Scripts Only. Okay, if this is checked, what you're looking to do is only affect the mono behavior script components on those objects that you've defined, while leaving the activation state of the objects alone. Okay, this is important if you've got a parent object with children on it, and you want to affect the parent. You want to turn some things on and off, but you can't turn the parent off without automatically turning the children off. That's what Unity does by default. So instead what you can do is check this box, and you can affect those parents by their scripts, and instead of activating or deactivating the parent, it's going to disable or enable the script components on those objects that you've defined. and we'll leave the activation state alone so that the children can remain there. Okay, I'm going to have to explain more on the use of that in another demonstration. Okay, but for now, enough to say that I have two events, one where I activate the particle emitters and the mover, and the second event where I simply turn off the particle emitters again. Okay. The event manager does not work alone. It needs to be triggered by event triggers, and there are two of them. Let's look at the first one. Event series. This is meant to fire a sequence of events in time. So let's look at the properties. First is the event manager reference to effect, and we have defined our event manager. Next is the event sequence itself, and I have two events that I want to fire. First, I want to fire event step 0, and I want to do so over a delay of 0.5 seconds. In other words, I'm going to activate our event series tool, and it will go to the first event step in the sequence. It's going to wait half a second and then fire event 0. So after that, it's going to wait 8 seconds and then fire event 1. After the event sequence, the next property is used fixed update. And if this is checked, then this tool will run on the same schedule as rigid body physics. So if you need your events to fire on that same schedule and be in sync, then you want to check this box. But for most cases, you can leave this blank, and it will simply update every frame. The next property is reset on complete, and this, if checked, will reset the tool by deactivating it at the end of the event sequence and get it ready for reactivation so you can use it over and over. Let's hit play. Let's fire our rocket using the event series trigger. So we see all three things turning on, the mover and the two particles, and after 8 seconds the particles turn off. Great. That's the event manager and the event series. The last tool we're going to look at is event single. As the name suggests, the event single tool is meant to fire a single event, as opposed to the series of events the event series tool does. But a lot of the properties are the same. There are some unique differences to this tool that make it a little more powerful, actually. The first property is the event manager. Again, we have defined our event manager as the reference to effect. The next property is event step, because we're only affecting a single event. There's just one to define, and we're going to fire event 0. The next property is relay on activate. Okay, if this is checked, then the tool is assuming that it needs to be activated before trying to fire the event. Okay, if this is unchecked, then what it does instead is assume that there is a collider on this object, and it will wait for a collision event in order to fire the event. The next property is relay delay, and if relay on activate is checked, then it will delay this amount of time in seconds from the activation of this tool until firing the event. The next property is valid collider. So if relay on activate is unchecked and you have a collider on this tool, but you do not want the event to fire unless a particular collider is colliding with it, say the player character's collider, then you want to put a reference to that game object here. Okay, but I am going to activate it manually. The next property is conditional if active. What this is defining a reference to an object that must be active in order to fire the event. Okay, if it is not active, but the conditions, either collision or time, are still in play, it will continue to try to fire the event until this object is active. Why would you want a conditional if active object reference here? Let's say you've got a door, and the door is collision based, so the player could walk up to the door and open it, but you only want the player to get through the door if they have a key. Alright, what you can do is set up another game object that represents the state at which the player character has a key, and you only activate it when the player character gets the key. Otherwise it's deactivated. Alright, then you put a reference to that object here, and when the player character walks up to the door, it's going to check and see if that object is there, if it's active. And if not, they can't get through the door. If they can, if they have the key, they open the door, and yay. Okay. The next property is use fixed update. If this is checked, this tool will work on the same schedule as rigid body physics. And for most cases, you can leave this unchecked and it will update every frame. Last is reset on trigger. If this is checked, it will deactivate the tool once the event is fired and get it ready for reactivation so you can use it over and over again. And I have checked this because I do want to fire event 0, and then during runtime I'm going to change it to 1 and fire it again. Okay, because I want to launch the rocket, and then I want to turn the particles off again. Let's launch our rocket again using event single. So I'll hit the trigger, wait half a second, and then fire the event. And it's launching. That's great. I'm going to go ahead and hit it to event step 1, fire it again, and it turns the particles off. That is event single, that is event series, and that is event manager and counter trigger. And that's all the time we have on this video. Please stay tuned for the next one.